This is the Middle Earth philosopher. The relationship between the High Elves and the mortals of Middle Earth spans across all three ages that are known to us. That is, the latter period of the First Age up to the entirety of the Third Age. And by the Fourth Age, with the exception of the Dark Elves, the High Elves have pretty much all left by that point. A fact that is barely remembered by any mortals at all because of, mortality, and to a lesser degree, the High Elves themselves, because any remaining of their number were steadily leaving Middle Earth throughout the Third Age. Because, supposedly, this was supposed to be the last time that the two races fought side by side before the elves start to leave Middle Earth. But whether you go by the movie version or the official book version, I found both of these not to be the case. You see, when I saw the movie The Two Towers in theaters, I can recall very easily how many were surprised and even upset over the sudden appearance of the Elven army led by Haldir of Lothlorien to reinforce the defenses at Helm's Deep, not foreseen by any of the besieged defenders there, including Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, and for that matter, any of the people in the audience as well, apparently. He delivers a message from Elrond saying that they were sent as a remembrance of the old alliances and how the elves and men used to, quote-unquote, fought and died together, and that they were, quote-unquote, honored to fight alongside men once more, end quote. Even before the age where internet outrage was in full swing, I can easily recall the outrage being pretty loud. Quote, "The elves weren't at Helm's Deep," end quote. So, at that time, I had to do some digging and asking around as to what they were referring to, but I eventually found that they were referring to how in the books, the elves weren't indeed at Helm's Deep. But I also found out something else. That is, even in the books, the last alliance was not the last time elves fought with men during the Third Age. Now, the more well-known example of this, I would think, should have been more obvious to the book defenders of the Battle of Five Armies. That is, it's in The Hobbit. But you can also argue that it doesn't count because those elves were not High Elves, or even Sindar for that matter, with the exception of Thranduil and, depending on which version of the battle you go with, Legolas as well. But rather they were Sylvan Elves, or Oquindi, those who never saw Valinor and had no interest in going over, much less arguably even heard of it by this point. That being said, the other one I can see not being as well known, as its account is not mentioned in the main story of The Lord of the Rings, but in the appendices as well, and I can easily also understand how many readers would pass this over or consider this an addendum or a bookend, would be the Angmar Wars. The Angmar Wars had occurred 1,000 years before the main story of Lord of the Rings, and concerned the fall of the northern kingdom of Arnor, sister kingdom of Gondor. I'm pretty sure most of you are pretty much familiar with the major points of that already, so I'm just going to skip to the points that are relevant here. There were still a large enough number of Noldor High Elves left in Middle Earth where they intervened twice during those long series of conflicts in the north. And in the second one, they worked with Gondor and the survivors of Arnor to finally destroy Angmar's army and run the Witch King out of Western lands for, as I said earlier, over 1,000 years. So, by this measure, the longtime fans that complained about the elves' arrival at Helm's Deep were both correct and at the same time incorrect. The elves were not at Helm's Deep, but they had fought alongside mortals after the Second Age. Having established that, this was why I didn't have a problem with Peter Jackson's adaptation of the Battle of Helm's Deep. That, while the details and facts didn't align with the books entirely, I felt that the underlying themes of the long-standing loyalty between the two races did. That is, that even in the books, the relationship between the High Elves and the men of Gondor and Arnor more or less is only barely hinted at. And if you read through the entirety of the books, you only get the full story at the very end, which is literally the book end of the story. That is, the appendices. So, even in the movies where we actually do see a full-scale elven army working with a full-scale human army, through the flashbacks of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, it's still only a flashback, something that only hints to the glory that once was. Having established that, this was why I didn't have a problem with Peter Jackson's adaptation of the Battle of Helm's Deep. That, while the details and facts did not align with the books, I did feel that the underlying themes of the long-standing loyalty and relationship between the two races did. And in that, in both the books and the first movie of the Fellowship of the Ring, we are only hinted at and told that elves and men used to have this very tight relationship where they would work together. But throughout the main story, especially in the books, we see nothing of that. All we pretty much see is more or less Elrond's two sons fighting alongside Aragorn during the final, well, not the final battle, but the battle at front of the Gates of Gondor. So, even in the movies, where they try to expand a little bit on this in the first movie, showing that grand flashback of the last battle during the prologue of that particular movie, it was still only a hint of the glory that once was. It was pretty much like, okay, they had a relationship, so what? Not something that conveyed any kind of feeling of connection or understanding to the audience of, okay, wow, these guys were really tight. And now that doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't hit as hard, basically. And I liked how they had worked that into the story of the Two Towers with the arrival of this regiment of elves from Lothlorien as a point of hope in the increasing darkness in the movie. Because, as we all know, whether in the second book or the second movie, whichever you want to go with, circumstances throughout Middle-earth are getting pretty dark and dire, and the War of the Ring is starting to kick into full swing at this point. So it's understandable that during these dark times, a point of light would be appreciated, basically. And I think the movie The Two Towers overall does a very good job of conveying this increasing darkness and almost despair that's falling on people over this particular event. And what I also pretty much enjoyed and appreciated was how they still use the elves to continue that theme of sacrifice that runs throughout all three movies, aka the death of Haldir. In an interview, it was said that the reason behind both the Elven army's demise, which I was confused about for a very long time, and Haldir's death was that the producers and directors felt that they needed basically a Boromir moment like they had in the previous movie. That is, Boromir's death conveyed to the audience the reality that these movies were not going to be a typical Hollywood hero's tale, where everyone comes out alive with a happy ending, and that sacrifices needed to be made if there's going to be any happy ending at all. And while the book The Two Towers version of the battle was just as dramatic and good, no one's shitting on that at all, it also did not have a Boromir moment where someone with whom the audience knew and connected with and had become somewhat close to suddenly died, thereby also conveying that sense of loss and full understanding of, oh shit, this is really bad. And from that point of view, it would be understandable why then Haldir and the Elven army also made an appearance at the beginning of the battle. That is, that in the books, at least, with the particular Fellowship of the Ring, there was something already written into the main story of a character having a particular moment. But in the Two Towers, we don't have that. Even the death of Theoden's son, is not really conveyed of any sense of how do we know this guy. We just know this guy is a high-ranking person and apparently someone of importance in Rohan, and now he's dead. Okay. Again, not shitting on the character, but there's no real way of connecting with him at all. And even in the movies, whether you want to criticize this or not, the brief hint of that particular battle where Theodred dies while it conveys a sense of loss, it doesn't have the same gravitas if you compare that to the loss of Haldir. Both are big deals, but one big deal is a big deal to one of the main characters in the story, which basically conveys why he is how he is, and the other one is a big deal to us, the audience, conveying why this situation with the war is getting really, really desperate and bad. So, having said all that, what do you guys think? If you saw the movies, do you recall this particular moment where the Elven army arrived at the gates of Helm's Deep? Did you feel that same sense of hope rising in the midst of darkness, or were you upset that they broke canon and introduced this regiment that should not have been there, basically, if you're going to go by the canon of the book? Let me know in the comments below, but otherwise, this is the Miller Philosopher. You guys have a good day.